Basket hilted swords offer a fantastic hand protection and were used by a few specific nationalities quite famously between the 16th century and the 19th century. In fact, they're even used for parade purposes today. Particularly notable are the British, that is the English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish, and in the British Isles, basket hilts were particularly popular. And a basket hilt, it completely encloses the hand. We've looked at these in a lot of previous videos. But what is a half basket hilt? Well, in this video, we're going to be looking at a couple and why they're like that. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now I'm very lucky in my profession as an antique arms dealer. I get to handle, buy and sell and own lots of wonderful antique weapons. Now recently I have obtained a couple of swords relating to the era of the Jacobite uprisings in the 1700s rather, in the early to mid 18th century. Between the 1710s particularly and the 1740s. Now for anyone who doesn't know, maybe we'll do a deep dive on this in the future, but essentially the Jacobite uprisings are primarily Catholic uprising against a primarily Protestant establishment in the British Isles, mostly focused in Scotland, but it went beyond that as well and expanded obviously to Ireland and even abroad in some cases, further afield. But really it was to do with a royal challenge, a royal dynastic challenge, because the monarchies of England and Scotland, since the time of the Stuarts, and let's be honest, going all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon period, the monarchies of England and Scotland, and in some cases Wales and Ireland as well, were inextricably intertwined, and it was a very complicated political situation. Now, without going too much further into it, just to say that the Jacobite uprisings, contrary to popular belief, are not simply a matter of England versus Scotland. In fact, Scots of various types fought on both sides. In some cases, English fought on both sides, and in many cases, Irish fought on both sides as well. So it was a very complicated situation. But nevertheless, at the end of this period, in 1746, we start to get a period widely known as the Highland clearances. And during that period, many basket-hilted swords, or weapons in general, were forbidden from being owned and carried and kept. We'll come back to that later in the video, including even Highland targes. So Highland targes around shields were made very widely in the 1740s, but pretty much stopped being made in 1746. Anyway, the typical type of basket-hilted sword that we see here, and this is one of the middle of the 1700s from Scotland, so this is a Scottish basket-hilted sword, are essentially symmetrical. You will notice that the hilt on one side has all the same bars and decoration and enclosure as it has on the other side. Now, one of the great benefits of this is you can be left-handed, okay? We'll come back to this point a little bit more later in the video, but fundamentally this is a symmetrical hilt. Now, the advantage of a symmetrical hilt is obviously it protects the outside of the hand as much as it protects the inside of the hand, great amount of hand protection, and it gives a certain amount of symmetry and balance to the sword. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, every sword has an edge to cut with. Some of them have two edges. Now, when we're cutting with a sword, there is a natural motion through the air of the sword moving, and if a sword is more weighted on one side or the other, it can, doesn't always, depends on the grip and how you hold it and how you move it, but it can lead to slightly twisting or overbalancing in one direction, and meaning that when you cut, you don't cut with a true edge. And obviously if the edge is not pointing in exactly the right direction at 90 degrees to the thing you're hitting, if it's 95 degrees off one way or the other, then it's going to foul the cut and lead to a poor cut. This was a topic which really fascinated military strategists in the 19th century when they found that lots of cavalry, not just in Britain, but in places like America and France and Spain and Italy, had problems actually cutting the targets they were aiming at. And a lot of this was to do with poor swordsmanship training, but a lot of it was to do with poor edge alignment, and this led to certain sword designers trying to build hilts which balanced more equally on either side. So the typical type of Highland basket hilt, or indeed various other basket hilts and backswords that went before and after this, are equibalanced, as it's sometimes termed. That is, they equally balanced on left and right, can be used by a left or right hander, and they don't theoretically twist in the hand when you use them. So you might think therefore that an equally balanced on left and right hilt was the natural form of the basket hilt. That's how it started out, and somehow it was corrupted or devolved from that point to lead to an asymmetrical hilt. Well, that would be the opposite of the truth, and sometimes theory doesn't marry up with what we actually find in history. And if we look at the earliest forms of the proto-basket, the beginnings of the basket hilt, just in the British Isles, but you could extrapolate this to southern Germany or parts of Italy or even Spain, what we see in the late medieval period is we start to see the very beginnings, the very genesis of the beginnings of what became a basket hilt. And here is an example. So in the Tudor period, or end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, we start to see, obviously we've already got knuckle bows, they'd been around for a little while, but we start to get side bows. And obviously in Germany we've got the Nagel, sometimes a side shell on things like Messer. This is the British equivalent of that. Now this is, while it is, you could call this a falchion or a Messer, to all intents and purposes, we could also call it a short back sword. It's a single-edged straight sword, almost straight sword, pretty much straight, but it has a sidebar. Now, it shouldn't take too much imagination to realise that when we've got a front bar and a side bar, we could add another bar on here, but they didn't, interestingly. They treated the outside of the hand and the inside of the hand differently, and that is because a fist is not symmetrical. Most of the hand projects on the, for a right-handed person, on the right side, and you've only really got the thumb and the tips of the fingers on the left side. That being the case, that means that you don't need as much hilt projecting on the inside as you do on the outside. Moreover, when you're actually using this in swordsmanship, when you're, for example, holding it in the right hand, it's the right hand side here which is most exposed, and if you defend on the inside line here, if the other person's right-handed, your left hand side of your hand is actually hidden behind the sword as you turn it to guard the inside line. So for multiple reasons to do with the shape of the hand, but also the nature of swordsmanship and the fact that swordsmanship is asymmetrical by nature, most people don't need as much hilt projecting on the left-hand side as they do on the right. This being the case, therefore, we find that swords develop more protection on the right-hand side, for right-handed swords that is, be the opposite for left-handed, but they develop more protection on the dominant or right-handed side of the sword than they do on the left. And it's not just swords, we even see it on things like left-hand daggers or parrying daggers, where the ring, and the side ring is something we often find on swords as well, is only on one side, not on both. And so we come to the first true basket hilts. Now, as I mentioned, there are other parts of Europe where they develop basket hilts, for example, southern Germany and Austria, also Italy, particularly up towards Venice. However, in the British Isles, we have a very early type of basket hilt, which already starts to appear in 1520, 1530, this kind of period. And by about 1540, it looks like this. Now, this is one of the replicas from the Windlass Royal Armouries line, which I obviously oversee and work with. And this is a pretty true to form replica. This is from the next batch that's being released, incidentally. This is a basket hilt, early basket hilt, so we're talking about the time of Henry VIII, around 1540, thereabouts. So similar time to when the Mary Rose, his flagship, sunk, as it happens with one of these basket hilts on. In fact, the example that we replicated from the Royal Armouries was not from the Mary Rose, but it's very similar to the Mary Rose sword. It's actually bigger than the Mary Rose sword, so it's kind of cooler in that way, I think. But you'll notice it's not a symmetrical hilt. Most of the protection is on the outside. We do have protection on the inside to protect the thumb and the tip of the fingers, but it's a lot less than the outside. So it's an asymmetrical basket. And this, if we discount, well, I mean, we could include or discount the earlier hangers and falchions, which have sidebars, but this is what most people would agree is definitely a basket hilt by this point, and it's asymmetrical. So the earliest basket hilts were asymmetrical, like this. And as an aside, this also carries over into forms of rapier and side sword hilt as well, where the protection on one side is made of a different assemblage of bars and a different style of protection on the dominant side compared to the offside. So now we come back to the 18th century, and by this period the basket hilted sword is one of the standard military swords in the British Isles, and in fact across a lot of Europe. There are other types of hilts like walloon hilts, there's various types of swept hilt which have been in use, and so on and so forth, and you know, sabre hilts and everything else. But basket hilts were very popular in 17th and 18th century Britain. Oliver Cromwell had a form of basket hilt known as a mortuary hilted sword. Maybe we'll do a deep dive on those in a future video. But basket hilts were very common, and many of them were symmetrical. However, by the time we get to the 1730s, 1740s, we start to see asymmetrical, that is half basket hilts, make a little bit of a comeback. So the first example we're going to look at here is this brass basket hilted sword here. Quite an enigmatic back sword as it happens, that is, it has a blunt back here, has a false edge up towards the tip, primarily a straight long single-edged cutting sword. So this is a back sword. Now there is an almost identical example in the Royal Armouries dated to around 1742, so just before Culloden era, and this is possibly associated with the King's Own Dragoons. Okay, now I won't go into the research of why that's the case, but essentially it boils down to the fact that it's got a brass hilt. And a brass basket hilt is quite unusual. Usually basket hilts, for strength reasons, are iron or steel, but they can be made of brass in certain circumstances. So this is possibly a back sword, a cavalry sword of the King's Own Dragoons, dating to about 1742, and you will notice that it has much more guard on one side than the other. Now you might say, okay Matt, but you've just said that that was completely normal in the Tudor and going all the way through to the Elizabethan period, and yes, that's true. However, in the 17th and most of the 18th centuries, symmetrical basket hilts like this Andrea Ferrara bladed example here, this Scottish basket hilt, I would say were numerically slightly more common. Or at least, well, we'll come back to that. There's a little detail, there's a caveat to add. So, however, you will notice that this possibly King's Own Dragoons version has an open side here. Okay, now we're going to look at another sword before we go into why. So this is another sword, almost identical in date. This is a much bigger sword, a whopping great broadsword blade on it. This has a steel hilt, and you will notice again it's open on the inside. So open on the inside, obviously protected at the front with the knuckle bow and slightly widened bar there, and then completely protected on the outside. So these are actually following, although they're very different hilt designs, they're from exactly the same period. They're both official British government heavy cavalry swords. That's probably Irish Dragoons, that's probably King's Own Dragoons. They're both open on the inside. So why would you want to do that? So there's a few possible reasons. So one of them is weight, and you could also say cost. Okay, so you use less material, but less material also equals less weight by not having the guard section on the inside line. And we've already described that you don't need it so much on the inside line as on the outside line, especially arguably on horseback as well, because on horseback, and these are both dragoon swords, you're using the sword here on this side mostly. If you are fighting across that side, you tend to do it with a hanging guard, which again brings that to the outside here. Sometimes you're going to end up with the inside of the hand exposed to an enemy horseman on that side, but probably statistically not as much as on this side. So weight, necessity, you don't really need it so much here. Cost, I think, is less important because a bit of steel doesn't cost very much. But very importantly, wearing, okay? So when remember, most of your time, especially in the 18th century, when you're riding around on a horse, most of your time is spent riding, scouting, all of this kind of stuff. It's not necessarily spent sword in hand or engaging sword against sword. So wearing the sword is what you mostly do. The sword spends most of its time in its scabbard, and wearing a sword that's banging against your side on horseback is going to be far less annoying when you don't have a big basket, where's the basket hilt? There it is, sticking out on the inside line here. So easier to wear, flatter to the body, more comfortable, less weight. Now it does create a problem of overbalancing, as I described. So potentially, because we've got a heavier guard on that side, the grip is going to tend to turn in the hand when you cut. As it so happens, the way that they've counterbalanced that with this particular sword is this grip is quite flat. So rather than being cylindrical, it's actually quite an ovoid section. So you can feel the edge alignment in your hand. And actually, I don't feel any likelihood of that turning in my hand when I move it at all, because it's quite flat in the hand. With the other one, I think it's similar. It's a relatively flat grip. It's much thinner that way than it is that way. So you can feel the edge alignment pretty good, and it doesn't really make any difference. But there is one final advantage to having this open section on the inside, and it's actually related to the fact that I mentioned that a lot of basket hilts look symmetrical but actually aren't. So if we go to this standard basket hilt here, which looks the same on both sides, some dragoon swords, dragoons being cavalry, have a ring or loop or open section on the inside line here, and that gives us an important clue, because that's to put the reins of the horse through. Why would you want to do that? Well, normally you have a sword in one hand and you have your reins of your horse in the other hand, okay? But sometimes you want to shoot one of your pistols, okay? And in that case, you don't want to lose the reins or drop them down and have to fumble around and find them again. So you take the reins, you put them into your sword hand, so you hold the reins in the sword hand, you pull the pistol out, you fire the pistol, put it back in the holster on the saddle bow, and then you take the reins out again. So it's a way of being able to access your hand and grip things and do things with this hand through a loop in the hilt. So although they're sort of symmetrical hilts, they're actually not, because they have this open ring on the inside. Now, you will notice you don't need to do that if you have a completely missing inner section. It means that you can use your hand on the inside line here, whether you're using it for the reins of the horse or to cock the hammer on the pistol to shoot it. So simply to say that there are many potential reasons why you might want to have a half basket hilt instead of a full basket hilt, and I think I've covered most of those reasons here. But there is a twist to this story, and that twist takes us back to the Battle of Culloden and the Jacobite uprising. So on paper, these swords carried by government cavalry were used against Highlanders and people from various bits of Scotland, in fact, carrying basket hilts like this. But it's not always as clean cut as that when we come to swords, or indeed history or politics. Because actually this sword, which on paper is a British government sword, or kind of loyalist sword, whatever you want to call it, this actually came from a Perthshire family who'd been involved in the uprisings, and it came with something else. And it had been with this other thing since those uprisings. It came with this. So although this was a government sword, somehow it probably ended up in the hands of a Highlander in the Jacobite forces, carrying a targe as well. So I hope some of you learned something today. We've looked at half basket hilts, why they existed in various forms, and the fact that they didn't suddenly appear. They had been around since the very beginning. There are many reasons why with any kind of basket hilt you don't necessarily want it to be the same on both sides. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon for another video. Cheers folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.